Hello there. I'm Rosie, a 30-year-old who works as a manager at a local company. I live with my husband, Jake, in a house that I own. It's nothing fancy, just a cozy place we call home. I guess you could say I'm a pretty modest person, not one to make a fuss. I have a lot of patience, which has always been a strength of mine, or so I thought. Jake and I get along really well. He's a great guy, supportive and kind. We've been married for a few years now, and it's been mostly smooth sailing. Well, except for one little, actually, not so little issue. His parents, Robert and Susan. Now don't get me wrong. I understand the importance of family. But Jake's parents, they're a whole different story. They're very direct people, the type who say whatever is on their mind without thinking about how it might affect others. They don't really understand or respect personal space. It all started pretty harmlessly. Robert and Susan would drop by unannounced for breakfast or dinner. I didn't mind initially. After all, they were family. But it quickly turned into a regular thing. They'd come over whenever they felt like it. And because they had a key to our house, they would just walk in, even when we were not expecting them. One day, I was in the bathroom getting ready for work, and suddenly, I heard someone in the house. I peeked out and saw Susan in the kitchen. "Morning, Rosie. Thought I'd surprise you with breakfast," she said cheerfully. I remember forcing a smile and thinking, this is getting a bit much. Jake, bless his heart, tried to talk to them about it. "Mom, Dad, Rosie and I love having you over, but we also need our own space," he said one evening. But it didn't go well. Susan's eyes welled up with tears, and Robert's face turned red. "Are you saying you don't want us in your life?" Susan cried. "After all we've done for you!" Jake was caught off guard. "No, that's not what I meant." And just like that, the conversation ended. They played the victim card so well, Jake didn't stand a chance. I felt for him. He was torn between his parents and our life together. Things escalated from there. It wasn't just meals anymore. They started staying overnight in our guest room, and before we knew it, they were spending days at our place. It felt like we had permanent house guests. I tried talking to Jake again. "Honey, I love your parents, but this is getting out of hand. They're here all the time," I said, hoping he'd understand. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, Rosie. I'll try talking to them again." But deep down, I knew it was a lost cause. They had this way of making him feel guilty, and he just couldn't stand up to them. It was a tough spot, and I felt stuck. I loved Jake, but his parents were just too much. Life with Jake's parents dropping in whenever they pleased started to feel like a TV show where the same episode kept replaying. Breakfast turned into lunches, which turned into dinners, and before I knew it, our guest room seemed more theirs than ours. I tried to be understanding, but it was getting harder each day. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of pots and pans clanging in the kitchen. I rubbed my eyes and looked at the clock. It was barely 6:30 a.m. I wandered into the kitchen, still half asleep, and there was Susan, cheerfully making pancakes. "Good morning, Rosie. I thought we'd have a big family breakfast today," she said, not noticing the surprise on my face. I managed a polite smile. "Good morning, Susan. That's nice of you." I sat at the table, sipping my coffee, watching her move around our kitchen like she owned the place. Robert soon joined us, a newspaper under his arm. "Morning, Rosie. Sleep well?" he asked, not waiting for an answer as he got busy with the sports section. I nodded, still trying to wake up. Jake stumbled in a few minutes later, looking as surprised as I felt. "Mom? Dad, what are you doing here so early?" he asked, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "We wanted to surprise you with breakfast," Susan said, flipping a pancake with a flourish. Jake gave me an apologetic look, which I returned with a resigned shrug. After that day, their visits became more frequent. They started leaving personal items in the guest room, which soon looked like their second bedroom. I tried to talk to Jake about it, but he was in a tough spot. "I know it's a lot, Rosie, but they're my parents. What can I do?" he'd say, looking genuinely torn. I nodded, trying to be understanding. "I get it, Jake, but we need our own space too." One evening, I found Susan rearranging our living room. "I thought this would look better over here," she said, pushing the couch to the other side of the room. I couldn't help but feel a little annoyed. "Susan, I appreciate your help, but I liked it the way it was." She looked at me, surprised. Oh, I just thought it needed a change. But okay, I'll put it back. I watched as she reluctantly moved the couch back, feeling a bit guilty for snapping at her. Things came to a head one night when I came home from work, exhausted, only to find a small gathering in our living room. Robert and Susan had invited some friends over without telling us. "Rosie, dear, we thought we'd have a little get-together. Hope you don't mind," Susan said, handing me a glass of wine. I looked around at the unfamiliar faces in my living room and felt my patience wearing thin. "Actually, Susan, I do mind. Jake and I had plans tonight." The room went silent, and Susan's face fell. "Oh, I didn't realize. We'll wrap this up then." Jake came to my rescue. "Yeah, Mom, we had a quiet evening planned. Maybe check with us next time?" They ended the gathering shortly after, but the damage was done. I felt like a stranger in my own home, and it was clear something had to change. I tried talking to Jake again. "This can't go on, Jake. We need to set some boundaries with your parents." He nodded, looking more determined this time. "You're right, Rosie. I'll talk to them. This is our home, and we should feel comfortable in it." The breaking point came when Jake and I planned a short holiday. We needed a break, a chance to recharge and get away from everything, including the constant presence of his parents in our house. I was really looking forward to it. "We'll be gone for a week, just the two of us. It'll be nice," I said to Jake as we packed our bags. He smiled, wrapping his arm around me. "I can't wait. We need this, Rosie." We informed Robert and Susan about our trip, expecting them to understand. "We're going away for a week. Just wanted to let you guys know," Jake told them over dinner. Susan looked surprised. "A whole week? What about the house? Who will look after it?" I exchanged a glance with Jake. "The house will be fine, Susan. It's just a week." We left for our holiday, and for the first few days, it was bliss. No unexpected visitors, no rearranged furniture, just peace. But our peace was short-lived. On the third day, we received a call from Jake's work. There was an emergency, and they needed him back. Our relaxing getaway was cut short. We were both disappointed, but understood that these things happen. We arrived home 2 days earlier than planned, expecting to walk into an empty house. But what we found was far from it. The moment we opened the door, we were greeted by the sound of laughter and music. There were people in our living room, people we didn't know. "What the?" Jake muttered, looking as confused as I felt. We walked in further, and that's when we saw them. Robert and Susan, in the midst of a group of strangers, having what looked like a party. "Mom? Dad? What's going on?" Jake asked, his voice a mix of surprise and anger. Susan looked up, her smile fading when she saw us. "Jake, Rosie, you're back early." "Who are these people?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Robert cleared his throat. "Well, we thought since you were away, we'd rent the place out to some friends, just for a few days." I felt my jaw drop. "You did what?" Jake looked like he was about to explode. "You rented out our house? Without even asking us?" Susan wrung her hands. "We thought it would be fine. You were away, and these friends needed a place to stay." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They had turned our home into a rental property without our permission. The nerve of it all left me speechless. Jake was fuming. "Everyone out. Now," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The strangers gathered their things, murmuring apologies as they left. Robert and Susan stood there, looking guilty but also defiant. "We didn't think it would be a problem," Robert said, trying to justify their actions. "A problem? You crossed a line. This is our home, not a hotel," Jake said, his voice shaking with anger. I stood there, watching the scene unfold, feeling a mix of anger, disbelief, and disappointment. This was it. This was the moment when I realized things couldn't go on like this. Something had to change, and it had to change now. After the house was cleared, Jake and I sat down with his parents. "This can't happen again. You can't just use our house like this," Jake said, trying to remain calm. Susan started crying. "We didn't mean any harm. We just thought—" "No, Mom. There's no excuse for this," Jake interrupted. "We need our privacy. We need you to respect our home." They apologized, promising it would never happen again. But their apologies felt empty, and their promises even more so. I looked at Jake, and I could tell he felt the same way. Exhausted and at my wits' end, I knew we had to do something. The love I felt for Jake propelled me to find a middle ground, a solution that wouldn't tear our family apart. The constant invasions by his parents were suffocating, and it was time to reclaim our space. "We need a break, Jake, and we need to do something about your parents," I said, the determination clear in my voice. Understanding the gravity of the situation, Jake nodded. "You're right. Let's plan a weekend getaway. But first, let's change the locks. They can't keep walking in like they own the place." So, before our much-needed escape, we executed our secret mission. Replacing the locks felt liberating, like we were finally setting boundaries that should have been there all along. With the new locks in place, we packed our bags. Before leaving, I suggested, "Let's turn off our phones. No distractions, no calls, just us." Jake agreed without a second thought, and we left for our weekend retreat, phones off, hoping for a few days of peace. Our weekend was a slice of heaven. We laughed, shared stories, and for a while, the chaos of our life seemed a distant memory. But as we prepared to head back, a nagging sense of uncertainty crept in. On our drive home, we finally turned our phones back on. Almost immediately, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I answered hesitantly. "This is Officer Daniels. Am I speaking with Mrs. Rosie Thompson?" A stern voice inquired. "Yes, this is she," I replied, my heart starting to race. "I'm calling about an incident at your residence. We have detained several individuals who broke the locks and entered your home." My mouth went dry. "Broke the locks? Entered our home?" "Yes, ma'am. It appears they were trying to gain unauthorized access. We have them at the station." I glanced at Jake, who was listening intently, his expression a mix of shock and confusion. "We'll be home soon, officer. Thank you for letting us know," I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady. Hanging up, I relayed the information to Jake. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, and he let out a long, deep breath. "Who would do that? And why?" I whispered, a sense of dread washing over me. "We'll find out soon enough," Jake replied, his jaw set firmly. As Jake and I drove home, the weight of uncertainty was heavy in the car. We both knew that whatever awaited us at home was bound to be unpleasant. The thought of strangers breaking into our home was unsettling, but deep down, I had a nagging suspicion about who might be involved. "We should have seen this coming," Jake said, breaking the silence. "Changing the locks was bound to set them off." I nodded, knowing he was referring to his parents. "Let's just deal with it and move forward. We can't let this ruin what we've built." Arriving home, we found a police car parked outside. My heart sank. This was real. Officer Daniels, a tall man with a stern face, greeted us. "We caught them trying to break in. They were quite adamant about getting inside," he explained. "Who were they?" Jake asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "It was your parents, Mr. Thompson, and some of their friends," Officer Daniels replied. Jake's face turned pale. "My parents? But why would they—" "It seems they were unaware of the lock change. When they couldn't get in, they tried to force their way," the officer continued. I could see Jake struggling to process the information. His parents had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. "Can we see them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "They're still at the station. You can talk to them there if you wish." Jake and I exchanged a look, a silent agreement passing between us. We needed to face this head-on. At the station, we found Robert and Susan sitting in a small room, looking both angry and embarrassed. Their friends were there too, looking equally uncomfortable. "Mom, Dad, what were you thinking?" Jake asked, his disappointment evident. Robert stood up, his expression defiant. "We came to check on the house. We always have a key. Why did you change the locks without telling us?" "It's our house, Dad. You can't just come and go as you please. We've talked about this," Jake replied, trying to keep his calm. Susan started to cry. "We just wanted to be close to you. We never thought you'd lock us out." "It's not about locking you out. It's about respect and privacy. You can't break into our house because you feel entitled to it, I said, finding my voice. Their friends looked on, awkward and silent, clearly regretting being part of this mess. We're sorry, but we didn't know what else to do, one of them mumbled. Officer Daniels stepped in. We understand it's a family matter, but breaking and entering is a serious offense. We need assurances this won't happen again. Jake looked at his parents, a mix of sadness and resolve in his eyes. This can't happen again, Mom and Dad. You need to understand boundaries. Robert and Susan nodded, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. We left the station with heavy hearts. The drive back home was quiet, each of us lost in our thoughts. The events of the day had taken a toll, and as we walked back into our home, we knew things would never be the same again. The days following the incident were like walking through a thick fog. Jake and I were trying to make sense of everything while dealing with the aftermath. We had to have several uncomfortable conversations with neighbors, explaining what had happened. It was embarrassing and draining. One evening, as we were sitting in the living room, Jake let out a long sigh. I never thought my parents would go this far, he said, shaking his head. I reached out and held his hand. It's hard, I know, but we'll get through this together. He squeezed my hand in response, and we sat there in silence, each lost in our thoughts. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence. I got up to answer it, finding our neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, standing there with a concerned look. Rosie, dear, is everything all right? We saw the police the other day, she said, her voice full of worry. Yes, Mrs. Henderson. It was a family issue, but it's under control now. Thank you for checking in, I replied, offering her a small smile. She nodded, still looking uncertain. Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me. After she left, Jake looked at me. Maybe we should have a small get-together. Invite the neighbors, clear the air. What do you think? I thought about it for a moment. That's a good idea. Let's do it this weekend. The preparations kept us busy, and for a brief time, it felt good to focus on something positive. We invited a few neighbors, keeping it small and casual. The day of the get-together arrived, and our guests slowly trickled in. The atmosphere was light, and the conversation flowed. It was a much-needed distraction. During the evening, Mrs. Henderson approached me. You two are such a lovely couple. It's a shame about the trouble with your in-laws. I gave her a reassuring smile. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. We're handling it the best we can. As the evening wound down, Jake and I felt a sense of relief. The event had served its purpose, easing the tension in the neighborhood. The past few weeks had been a roller coaster, but Jake and I knew what needed to be done. Setting boundaries was the only way forward. We sat at the kitchen table, carefully drafting the rules we felt were necessary for our sanity and the health of our relationship. We can't just go on like this, Jake. It's time for a change, I said firmly, pen in hand. He nodded, looking somber. I know. It's just going to be tough. Once we were ready, we invited Jake's parents over to discuss the new rules. The atmosphere was tense as they sat down in our living room. Jake cleared his throat, and I could see his hands were trembling slightly. Mom, Dad, we need to talk about some changes we're making, he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. His parents looked at us, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. We've decided to set some boundaries regarding your visits to our house, I continued, trying to sound as calm and composed as possible. Robert, Jake's father, raised an eyebrow. What kind of boundaries? Jake took a deep breath. First, we need you to call and ask before coming over. No more unexpected visits. And we can't give you the keys back. It's important for us to have our own space, I added, trying to sound as gentle as possible. Susan, Jake's mother, immediately looked upset. But we're family. Why are you doing this to us? It's about respect and privacy, Susan, I replied. We love you, but we need these boundaries for the sake of our relationship. Their reaction was immediate and emotional. Susan started crying, and John's face turned red with anger. This is outrageous! We're your parents! How could you treat us like strangers? Robert exclaimed, his voice raising. We're not trying to hurt you, Jake said, his voice strained. We just need some rules. Susan sobbed. We refuse to accept these rules. It's like you don't want us in your lives anymore." The conversation spiraled from there. No matter how much we tried to explain, they wouldn't listen. They categorically refused to comply with the rules and kept crying, playing the victims. Seeing no way to reach an understanding, Jake and I exchanged a resigned look. "Maybe it's best if we take a break from each other for a while," Jake finally said, his voice heavy with sadness. I nodded in agreement, though my heart ached at the thought. Jake's parents left our house in tears, and we were left in a deafening silence. It was one of the hardest decisions we had ever made, but we knew it was necessary. We needed space, and they needed time to understand and respect our boundaries. In the quiet of our home, Jake wrapped his arm around me. "I'm sorry it had to come to this." I leaned into his embrace. "It's okay. We had to stand up for ourselves. Maybe with time, they'll understand." As we sat there, I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt and sadness. But deep down, I knew we had made the right choice. Setting boundaries was essential, even if it meant stepping back from family for a while. We are not in contact with Robert and Susan at the moment. Perhaps you will condemn us for this, but we decided to wait until they themselves understand the wrongness of their actions. The first time I laid eyes on Michael was at a college seminar. We were both there for extra credits, though our paths were quite different. He was a business major while I was pursuing literature. I was drawn to him from the moment he raised his hand and posed a challenging question to the professor. After class, we found ourselves at the same coffee shop, and from there, it just seemed like the universe wanted us to be together. We chatted about everything, from college, hobbies, to our childhood memories. "I come from a pretty strict background," he mentioned, taking a sip from his cup. "My parents are deeply religious." I remember shrugging. "So? My parents are free thinkers. They always taught me to question everything." Michael laughed. "Sounds like we're from different planets." But despite our differences, there was an undeniable chemistry. We began to see each other more frequently, studying together and exploring the city during the weekends. About 2 years into our relationship, we decided to move in together. It was a practical decision. Our apartments were far from the university, and sharing a place made sense. Plus, we were inseparable by then. However, when Michael broke the news to his parents, it wasn't received well. At a dinner at their house, Mrs. Davis, Michael's mother, was the first to voice her concerns. "Living together before marriage? Michael, you know how we feel about that." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mom, times have changed. It's not a big deal." Mr. Davis chimed in. "In our house it is. You're living in sin." I could feel the weight of their stares. Wanting to ease the tension, I said, "We respect your beliefs, but this is our decision. We're adults." Mrs. Davis sighed. "It's just not the way we raised you." Michael took my hand. "Lizzie and I love each other. We want to start our life together, and I hope you can support that." The evening ended on a somber note, but Michael and I were firm in our decision. We found a cozy apartment close to campus and moved in. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Our bond grew stronger, but the strain with his parents was always in the background, like an old radio playing a sad tune. One evening, as we were settling into our new life, there was a knock on the door. It was Mrs. Davis, holding a pie. "I thought I'd come by and see how you two are doing," she said, looking around with a critical eye. "We're doing great, Mrs. Davis," I replied, trying to be cordial. She sat down, placing the pie on the table. "This is all temporary, right? You'll get married soon?" Michael cleared his throat. "We haven't decided that yet, Mom." As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the constant pressure from Michael's parents started to weigh on us. Our once carefree dates and movie nights began to have a shadow, the looming expectation of marriage. One evening, while we were making dinner together in our tiny kitchen, Michael broached the subject. "Lizzie, have you ever thought about, having a wedding?" I looked up from chopping the vegetables, surprised. "Like, for us? Are you proposing?" He smiled awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Not exactly. I mean, yes, I want to marry you someday, but right now, it's more about my parents. Maybe if we had a ceremony, they'd back off." I sighed. So you're saying a wedding without the legal paperwork? He nodded. Just a thought. We can invite friends, make it a fun day. My parents get their wedding, and we get some peace. It wasn't the romantic proposal I'd imagined, but I understood his reasoning. All right, I said slowly. But on one condition, we do it our way. No big church wedding, just something small and intimate. Michael grinned, relief evident on his face. Deal. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparations. We chose a beautiful outdoor venue, invited our close friends and family, and planned a simple but heartfelt ceremony. When we broke the news to his parents, their reaction was surprisingly subdued. An outdoor wedding? Mrs. Davis asked, raising an eyebrow. Well, it's unconventional, but if it means you two are taking the next step, I suppose we can support it. Mr. Davis added, as long as you're committed to each other, that's what matters. The day of the wedding was sunny and bright. I wore a simple white dress, and Michael looked dashing in his suit. Our friends cheered, and even Michael's parents seemed genuinely happy. During the reception, Mrs. Davis pulled me aside. Lizzie, I want to apologize, she began, her voice soft. I know we've been hard on you two, but seeing you together today, I realize that love is what truly matters. I smiled, touched by her words. Thank you, Mrs. Davis. That means a lot. The day ended on a high note, with everyone dancing and celebrating our love. It felt like we had finally won Michael's parents over, and I hoped this would be a fresh start for us. But as days passed, their daily visits began. They'd drop by unannounced, often with unsolicited advice or thinly veiled criticisms. It was as if the wedding had given them a free pass to interfere in our lives. One evening, as Michael and I were unwinding after a long day, there was a knock at the door. Opening it, I found Mrs. Davis holding a casserole dish. Just thought I'd drop off some dinner, she said, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Thanks, I replied, taking the dish. But you don't have to do this. She waved a hand dismissively. It's no trouble. I just thought, since you're always so busy, you might not have time to cook. I forced a smile, sensing the underlying judgment. We manage, but thanks anyway. As the door closed, I sighed deeply. Michael wrapped an arm around me. It'll be okay, he whispered. It started with the subtle comments, the not-so-innocent questions. Why is the house so messy? Or, have you considered cooking something more nutritious? Mrs. Davis would ask, her tone dripping with faux concern. One day, I came home from work, exhausted, to find her in our living room, reorganizing our bookshelves. Mrs. Davis, what are you doing? I asked, taken aback. She looked up, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Just thought I'd help tidy up a bit. These shelves looked so cluttered. Michael entered from the kitchen, holding 2 cups of tea. Mom's just helping out, Lizzie, he said, trying to play mediator. I took a deep breath, my patience waning. This is our home, Michael. We didn't ask for help. Mrs. Davis pursed her lips, her eyes watering. I'm just trying to be helpful. After all, now we're family. Days like these became more frequent. They'd pop by without notice, giving advice we never asked for, criticizing decisions we'd made together as a couple. It was clear they no longer saw boundaries. One evening, after a particularly trying visit from his parents, Michael and I sat down for a heart-to-heart. Michael, this has to stop, I began, my voice trembling with frustration. I can't live like this, feeling like I'm constantly being judged in my own home. He ran his fingers through his hair, looking equally stressed. I know, Lizzie, it's just, they're my parents. I don't know how to tell them to back off without hurting their feelings. I replied, but what about our feelings, our peace of mind? We can't keep sacrificing that for them. A week later, we invited them over for dinner, deciding to address the issue head-on. The evening started off pleasantly enough. We chatted about work, friends, and the latest news. But as the main course was served, I took a deep breath and dove in. Mrs. Davis, Mr. Davis, we invited you over because there's something we need to discuss, I began, trying to keep my voice steady. Mr. Davis looked up, his fork pausing mid-air. What's the matter? I exchanged a glance with Michael, who nodded in encouragement. It's about the frequent visits and, well, the constant input on our lives. Mrs. Davis looked taken aback. We're just trying to help. Michael took over. Mom, Dad, we appreciate that you care, but it's becoming overwhelming. We need some space to live our lives, make our mistakes, and grow together. Tears formed in Mrs. Davis's eyes. After all we've done for you, this is how you repay us? Mr. Davis added, his voice stern. We're just looking out for you. It seems Lizzie here doesn't appreciate family. I felt a pang of guilt, but stood my ground. It's not about appreciation. It's about respect, respecting our boundaries and our choices. The room grew silent, the tension palpable. Mrs. Davis dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, her shoulders shaking. We just wanted to be part of your lives. I never thought it'd come to this. Michael looked torn, his loyalty divided, but he held firm. Mom, we love you, but this is our life. We need you to understand that. The evening ended with Mrs. Davis in tears, Mr. Davis looking disappointed, and an unspoken agreement that things had to change. As they left, I felt a mix of relief and dread, wondering what the future held for our relationships. Days after the confrontation, the house felt unusually quiet. The constant visits had stopped, but the silence was both a relief and a curse. Every time the doorbell rang or there was a knock, my heart would race, expecting it to be Michael's parents. But it never was. One evening, as Michael and I sat on our couch, he broached the topic. Lizzie, do you think we were too harsh? I mean, they're my parents. Maybe we overreacted? I took his hand, feeling its warmth. Michael, it's not about being harsh. It's about setting boundaries. We did what we had to do. He sighed deeply. I know, it's just hard. I never imagined being in this situation with them. As days turned into weeks, we began to feel the weight of our decision. There were no more surprise visits, but there were also no calls or messages. It was as if we had cut ties completely. During this period, I often found solace in browsing property listings online. One day, as I was scrolling through, a beautiful house in a neighboring town caught my eye. It had a large garden, a spacious living area, and most importantly, it was far away from our current life. Michael, come look at this, I called out. He joined me, peering at the screen. Wow, it's beautiful. But why are you looking at houses? I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. I was thinking, maybe it's time for a fresh start, somewhere new, where we can create our own memories, away from all this drama. He looked surprised. You mean move? Leave everything behind? I nodded. It's drastic, I know, but maybe it's what we need. We discussed it at length, weighing the pros and cons. The idea of starting anew was enticing, but also terrifying. Yet, the more we talked, the more it felt right. A few weeks later, we visited the house. It was even more beautiful in person, and the neighborhood seemed perfect. After much consideration, I decided to use the money I had inherited from my grandmother to buy it. The day we signed the papers, I felt a mix of emotions. Excitement for the new beginning, but also sadness for what we were leaving behind. The move went smoothly, and soon we were settling into our new home. It felt like a dream. The peace and quiet were just what we needed. One evening, as we were enjoying a quiet dinner in our new dining room, Michael said, Lizzie, I think this was the best decision we ever made. I smiled, feeling content. I think so too. The first few months in our new home were like a dream. The mornings were quiet, filled with the chirping of birds, and the evenings brought a calm, tranquil energy. Michael and I fell into a comfortable routine, enjoying the privacy and peace that our new surroundings provided. The past seemed like a distant memory, and the tension that once surrounded our lives had all but disappeared. Until one fateful day. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when the doorbell rang. Michael went to answer it. I heard murmurs, and then a familiar voice. My heart sank. It was Mrs. Davis. I walked to the entrance, my face revealing my shock. There they were, Mrs. and Mr. Davis, suitcases in tow, standing at our doorstep. Mom? Dad? What are you doing here? Michael asked, his voice filled with surprise. Mrs. Davis smiled, a bit too sweetly. "We missed you, dear, and we thought, why not pay a visit?" I tried to keep my composure. "It's unexpected." Mr. Davis chimed in. "We just wanted to see where our son is living now. Is that so wrong?" Michael seemed torn. "Of course not, but a heads up would have been nice." Mrs. Davis looked around, her eyes scanning our home. "Oh, what a lovely place you have here. Much nicer than the old one." I bristled but said nothing. The visit turned into a stay. One night became 2, then 3. They began to settle in, making themselves comfortable, much like they had in our previous home. One evening, after dinner, I pulled Michael aside. "Michael, we can't go down this road again. We moved to escape this." He sighed. "I know, Lizzie, but they're my parents. I can't just throw them out." "Then what? Let them take over our lives again?" Mrs. Davis, who seemed to have overheard our conversation, walked over, her eyes welling up with tears. "Is that how you feel, Michael? That we're a burden?" Michael looked helplessly at me, then back at his mother. "Mom, it's not like that. We just wish you had told us you were coming." She sniffled. "We just wanted to be close to our son, but it seems we're not welcome here either." I had a sinking feeling when I heard Michael's parents mention they'd made a decision about their living situation. The two of us had recently been discussing the matter privately, hoping to find a delicate way to address the issue. Now, it seemed the matter was going to be thrust into the open. "Lizzie, Michael," Mr. Davis began, "we have some news." Michael shifted in his seat, already sensing what was coming. "Go on," he prompted. Mrs. Davis, trying to sound cheerful, said, "We've sold our house. We realized there's no need for it when we have such a lovely family home here with you two." My eyes widened in shock. "You did what?" "We wanted to be closer to you both," Mr. Davis explained, looking earnest. Mrs. Davis looked hurt. "We are family. Why wouldn't you want us here?" I took a deep breath and said what I'd wanted to say for a long time. "This house, it's mine. It's not owned jointly by Michael and me. It's in my name only." I retrieved a file from the study, showing them the ownership documents. Mrs. Davis looked at the papers and then back at me, clearly stunned. "But you're married. What's yours is Michael's and vice versa." I smiled triumphantly. "That's where you're mistaken. We held a wedding ceremony, yes, but Michael and I never legally married. We never signed any official documents, so, technically, you're not my in-laws." The weight of my words seemed to hang in the air. Mrs. Davis's face turned a shade paler, her eyes widening in disbelief. Mr. Davis looked from me to Michael, seeking some form of denial. Michael took my hand, signaling his support. "It's true, Mom and Dad. We thought you'd be more accepting if we had a ceremony, but we never felt the need to get the state involved in our relationship." Mrs. Davis began to sob. "So, you deceived us? And now you're throwing us out?" The room was heavy with tension after the bombshells were dropped. Michael's parents were clearly taken aback, but it wasn't long before the shock turned into outrage. "So, you tricked everyone with a sham wedding? And you think that makes everything all right?" Mrs. Davis's voice had a hint of venom. Michael sighed. "It wasn't about tricking anyone. It was about the way we wanted to live our lives. The ceremony was for us, and those who wanted to celebrate our love." Mrs. Davis's face turned a shade redder. "You dare defy the sanctity of marriage, live together in sin, and then mock us with a fake wedding." "I've had enough," Mr. Davis declared, standing up suddenly. "You, young lady, are nothing but a sinner and a witch, trying to pull my son away from his family, his values." I was taken aback by the fierceness of their reaction, but I wouldn't let them intimidate me. "I have not taken Michael from anyone. He's made his own choices, and it's high time you respect them." Mrs. Davis's eyes were filled with tears, but her voice was stern. "Michael, come home with us. Leave this woman. She's done nothing but pull you into her web of deceit." Michael, ever the calm in the storm, replied, "Mom, Dad, I love you both, but my place is here, with her. She's been nothing but kind and understanding, even when you both haven't been. You can't just demand I leave her." "You're choosing her over us?" Mr. Davis's voice was a mix of anger and disbelief. I'm choosing to live my life on my terms, Michael asserted. The room went silent for what felt like an eternity. The air was thick, every breath heavy. Mrs. Davis's face was a mask of hurt and betrayal. "Very well," she said, her voice cold. "But remember this, you're turning your back on your family, on your faith, all for her." "I'm not turning my back on anyone," Michael said. "I just wish you'd see that." Mrs. Davis's eyes were hard, her voice bitter. "Let's go," she said to her husband, not giving either of us another glance. And with that, they left, leaving behind a wake of hurt, confusion, and uncertainty. I looked at Michael, his face a mirror of my own feelings. We both knew that things had changed irrevocably, and there was no going back. A few days after the confrontation, as I was heading back from work, my neighbor, Mrs. Carlson, called out to me. She was an older lady, known for her daily walks and her uncanny ability to know everyone's business. "Did you hear about the Davis family not selling their house?" she asked with a knowing look. I paused, taken aback. "What do you mean?" She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "They never put their house on the market. I heard from Susan, who heard from Janice, who works at the town's real estate office. There's no record of the Davis property being up for sale." I felt a knot form in my stomach. Were they lying to us all this time? When I got home, I shared the information with Michael. He looked shocked. "I can't believe they'd lie to us. What were they trying to achieve?" We both knew the answer. They wanted to manipulate the situation to their advantage. The realization was a hard pill to swallow. All this time, while we tried to understand and accommodate them, they had been playing a game. Michael sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. This changes things. It's one thing to have disagreements, but outright deception? That's something else entirely. We can't keep letting them pull us into their manipulative games, I said firmly. We need boundaries, strong ones. Michael nodded. You're right. We can't continue like this. It's unhealthy for us and for our relationship. The next day, he went over to his parents' house. He needed to confront them, get some answers. When he returned, his face was a mix of anger and sadness. They admitted it, he began, his voice heavy. They thought that if they moved in with us, we'd be a proper family again. They felt threatened by our independence. We sat down, discussing our next steps. It was clear that for our own sanity and the health of our relationship, we needed distance from them. We need a break, Michael declared. Some time away from all this drama and manipulation. I agreed. It's the best decision for us right now. That evening, we sent a message to his parents, informing them of our decision. The reply was filled with anger and accusations, but we remained firm. We needed this, for ourselves and for our future. The next few weeks were quiet. We focused on each other, rebuilding the trust and closeness that had been strained over the past months. One evening, as we sat on our porch, looking at the stars, Michael turned to me. "Thank you," he whispered, "for standing by me, for fighting for us." I smiled, squeezing his hand. "Always." The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but it was a poignant reminder of the importance of boundaries, honesty, and mutual respect in any relationship. As the night deepened, we looked towards the future, hoping for peace and understanding.